is up, everybody? What's up? Welcome back. Welcome back. We're here with some more MMA DFS picks and lineup advice. This time for DraftKings and FanDuel, UFC 295. We have two title fights. We have Jiri Prochazka, Alex Pereira for the light heavyweight strap, and then we have the short notice heavyweight title fight. Tom Aspinall, Sergei Pavolvich. And we're here to break it down for you. What more could you want? Welcome. I'm Brian Juster, co-founder here at Occupy Fantasy, joined by Jake the Snake, owner of MMADFS.com. Jake, the last time we talked was the last pay-per-view event, at least here on stream. So what's up, man? Good to see you. How you doing?
Yeah, man, these videos have become few and far between when every other slate has 11 fights. But good to be back.
I know we were planning on it last week, and we got the late cancellations, including the one post lock. So yeah, it's been a rough stretch of slates here, but this one looks pretty good. And we'll get into all of it here. There's a pretty interesting ownership dynamic, especially on DraftKings. But what we're going to do in this video, we'll be here for 30 to 45 minutes. A lot of it will depend on the questions you have. This is a live Q&A. You see the chat box here to the right of the YouTube screen. So go ahead and throw in questions you have, and we'll answer them periodically throughout the show. If you're watching this on replay, the best way to get in touch with us is through Discord. We'll be there all night answering questions and sweating out the fights. Link is in the description below. But we're going to do in this video, we're going to break down the main events, plural. There are two of them. Jake has some interesting data on two title fight cards. We'll talk about who we think is going to win each fight, how that matters for DFS. We'll talk about the one newcomer on the card making their UFC debut. We'll play good fighter, bad fighter, good matchup, bad matchup for those fighters that have less than 4 fights under their belt in the UFC. And then we'll close out with our prize picks play of the week, a fight that you have to target in DFS, and our stream parlay of the week, which is a special title fight edition. 2 bets from the title fights that we're going to parlay together, so make sure you stick around to the end for that. So Jake, this card changed pretty dramatically pretty recently, but we still have 2 5-rounders on the card. We have 13 fights on the card. Before we dive into the individual matchups, I know you have some data and some stuff you want to share on how people should be approaching it, especially on DraftKings when there are 2 5-round fights on the card.
Yeah, I mean, we try to touch on it every time, and every time I kind of go back, look back at all the data we have, make sure nothing's changed, see if any interesting patterns have emerged. So I mean, and a lot of people haven't seen the old streams, so we'll just go over kind of start to finish here. So it's a 2 5-round fights on this card. We've had 16 of those slates since the start of 2022. Only one of those 16 left had 0 5-round fighters in it. So pretty rare when that happened. That card was on Whaley sub Esparza in round 2, only scored 93 DraftKings points. And Alex Pereira was actually on that card. That was when he knocked out Adesanya in round 5, only scored 92 points. Neither one of them was a top 6 scorer. Therefore, they got left out of the optimal lineup. That was the only instance where we haven't had any 5-round fighters. So pretty rare. So 7 of the 16 winning DraftKings lineup had exactly 1 5-round fighter. The average split was only 5, so pretty low on that. 5 of those 7 winners played 1 favorite, and then 2 had a single underdog. On the 5 with a favorite, we had 3 winning 5-round faves and 2 winning dogs that were left out. So the other side, obviously there's going to be 2 winners in all these fights. So it's not always, 2 faves and then 1 just outscores the other. We have had some winning underdogs where they still don't score enough to end up. So it's just something to keep in mind. On the 2 slates where we had a single dog in the winner, both of those, both underdogs won on those cards. And then when you get both underdogs winning, it's less important to have the second one. You basically need the higher score, you get the value out of that. You don't necessarily need both of them. So typically, if you're going to play the idea of just a single underdog, you're probably going to need both underdogs to win historically, and then you just play one of them. So just something to keep in mind. So looking back at just catching up here, just doing a million things. So looking back at the 7 5-round fighters who won on those slates but were left out. So these are the ones where we had a single 5-round fighter in the winner, and then we had 1 5-round winner that was left out. We had Francis Ngannou, round 5 decision over Cyril Gane, only scored 93 points, 7.8K, not a top 6 score. Carla Esparza, also a low volume. You might remember that.
Love that slate.
Namajunas, round 5. Yeah, I'm sure you did. Round 5 decision, only scored 53 points, still got left out at 7.3K. We had Valentina Shevchenko, and this one's interesting because this is the only one that was priced out. She won a 5-round decision over Tyler Santos, scored 115 points. She was 9.6K, and she was the third highest score on the slate, but she got priced out of the winner just based on her price. That's the only time that someone's been priced out, whereas they were a top 6 scorer, but they just, salary couldn't make it work. So we had Adesanya, round 5 decision over Jared Cannonier, only 86 points, 9.46K, not a top 6 scorer. Brandon Moreno, back-to-back round 3 knockout wins, only scored 80 and 99 points. One of those, he was 8.9K. And then, interestingly, one of them, he was 8K and scored 99 points. Still not a top 6 scorer. So that's kind of relevant here where you have a guy that's priced at 8K, scores around 100, still not in the winning lineup. And then the most recent one, we had Bilal Muhammad, round 5 decision over Gilbert Burns, only scored 83 points, also priced at 8K. Just shows that, even a round 5 decision, you can fail to really score that well, not a top 6 score. So historically, generally, it's when we get these lower volume 5-round decisions or kind of a mid-round knockout, and that's the way that these guys get left out. And you can kind of look at them, and a lot of the guys, you're like, okay, that makes sense that they wouldn't have been a top 6 scorer. You got Moreno, historically not a big scorer. Adesanya, historically not a big scorer. Bilal Muhammad can kind of go either way. Esparza, yeah. I mean, the one surprise was Nagano. You got that random 5-round decision over Gon. Wrestles a ton, which isn't really his thing. I mean, that one was surprising, but a lot of the time you can kind of sort of see these coming. The Shevchenko one priced out a little bit weird. So it's just semi-predictable. So something to keep in mind is that, it happens more often when you get a guy where it would make sense that they wouldn't put up a huge score. So then we had 8 of the 16 winning DraftKings lineups had exactly 2 5-round fighters. So 50% of the last 16 slates with 2 5-round fights. Half of them, you get 2 of the 5-round fighters in the winner. Average split was 14. So it goes up significantly because this is primarily what the field is doing is, they're trying to pick the 2 winners. They're starting their lineups with that. They're, jamming in the different combinations, and then they're working from there. So it makes sense naturally that we're going to get more people playing those lineups, the more splits when they do win. Both favorites won twice. Only 2 of the 8 had both favorites. And the splits on those 2 were 10 and 87. So average of 48.5. So historically, it's hard to make much money if you play both favorites, and that's what ends up being in the winning lineup. So generally, that's what we're trying to avoid. We kind of bring that up every time. Doesn't win very often, and when it does win, you're splitting with a ton of people. So then the other 6 times, it was 1 dog and 1 favorite, and the average split in those was only 3, down from 48 when you play both favorites. So that seems like a pretty viable strategy right there. Get 1 favorite, 1 dog. And historically, most of the slates, the pricing isn't coin flips on both fights. So from a salary perspective, that build makes a lot more sense where you're like, okay, well, it's harder to get both in there because people can get priced out theoretically.
Right.
And it's less likely for both underdogs to win. So naturally, it kind of makes sense. Whereas this slate, you can kind of see like, okay, they're both kind of coin flips. So maybe this slate doesn't follow the historical rules, but you never know. I mean, we're still going to point them out. You got to know the rules before you break them.
Absolutely.
And then over those last 16 slates, we have had 0 5-round fight stacks. We did have a couple back in 2021, the fall of 2021, but it's been a while. 0 for the last 16. I know people always want to ask about fight stacks. There has not been a fight stack on one of these slates, since the start of 2022. But if you were going to go that angle, it requires the favorite to win basically a close, high-volume decision, and only 1 to 2 other underdogs on the slate to win. So in this case, the most likely outcome would be Pereira and Jiri somehow goes the distance, super high-volume decision. Alex wins, and Jiri is a top 3 dog on the slate. Unlikely, impossible, maybe not. So historically, that's all the data. But I will say that this slate is a little bit unique in the sense that both fights are essentially coin flips. And they're all pretty high upside. I would say of the 4 5-round fighters on the slate, Alex Pereira, for at least my projections, has the lowest kind of raw projection if you don't factor in odds. So I could see him potentially being left out. But, Tom Aspinall gets the win. Most likely he's going to score enough to return value at 8,200. Sergei Pavolvich at 8K, harder for him to get left out. Jiri has historically scored very well. So it is a little bit trickier. And I think normally I would I always tell people, like, I think the best strategy is to play exactly one 5-round fighter, but I get it on this slate wanting to play two. I mean, I think the field's going to do that too. So you'll get even more leverage if you only play one. But I do understand going the two route. And I think if one gets left out, the easiest guy to get left out is Alex Pereira here. So I think that's pretty much what I have. And the last thing I'm going to note is on the May 6th slate, I was looking for a similar slate like this where we had two coin flips, and that was the closest one I could find. That was the Bilal Muhammad versus Burns and the Henry Cejudo versus Aljamain Sterling, and both underdogs won. Bilal Muhammad won and got left out of the winner. And then we looked back at ownership just to get an idea to compare it to this slate. And basically, all of the different two-way combos were about 12 to 15% owned. All of the one-offs were about 6 to 10% owned. And in the end, about 55% of the field played exactly two 5-round fighters on that slate. About a third of the field played just one. About 10% of the lineups had 0 5-round fighters, and about 1 to 2% stacked fights. So they either had 2 fighters stacked or 3 or 4. I combined those all with stacks. So I thought those numbers were pretty interesting. I figured I'd share them.
Yeah, I mean, this slate is just super interesting, but with two high volatility coin flip matchups, and you made a lot of great points there, how this slate is different, how it normally compares, and I'll ask you a couple more things here, Jake. Well, first of all, I got to say, with these, I've been a very profitable MMA player for the past 3 years. I don't know if there have been two guys more destructive to my bankroll than Jiri and Pavlovich, and it is scary if you're playing a single lineup, because we know many of our viewers, many of our members play just one lineup per slate. To play this slate, right? How do you pick between Aspinall and Pavlovich? How do you pick between Pereira and Prochazka? And it's very difficult. And you and I were talking, and I think it's actually a good slate if you play just one lineup, right? Make your single entry, leave 2 spots for the championship fights, and then I would honestly take the allocation you were going to play in a single entry, spread it across 4 single entry, or sorry, 4 small field GPPs. And let's say you're going to play a $100 single entry, spread it out to 4 $25, have the same lineup, and just flop combinations. Prochazka and Pavlovich one, Prochazka and Aspen on the other, flop the other 2, and just get it that way, because I know we're going to break down the main events here in a second, Jake, but it wouldn't shock anyone here listening, watching, if either one or both of the winners scored 100 plus and the other scored 2 points, right? So it is a very difficult small field slate to take stands on this championship events.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, they're both, I think the odds, are fairly accurate. I mean, we can pick them apart a little bit and say one guy is 60-40 or the other guy's 40-60 or even tighter than that. But yeah, I mean, I would say everyone there has a pretty good shot to win, and everyone's got a pretty good shot to score single digits in a loss.
Yeah, which makes it that's not the type of slate you want for small field GPPs, but it makes it all the more interesting and all the more profitable to make multiple lineups and spread out that allocation. Before we get into these 2 title fights, again, if you guys have questions, throw them in the chat. We will answer them before we get out of here. We're here for probably until 3:45 or so. Multiple comments or questions about Benoit Saint-Denis, who is likely going to be the most, if not one of the top 3 most popular fighters on the slate with his outrageous game logs. 149, 136, 115, 105, and then 43 in a loss. Jake, I know reading your content, reading the plug, talking to you, you're a little bit on the Frivola train here, but how would you suggest people approach Benoit Saint-Denis as one of the highest owned fighters and one of the highest ceiling fighters on the card? Let's say for small field and for large field, how would you handle him? How would you recommend people handle him?
Yeah, I think in a perfect world, you play at least one small field and one large field lineup, and you play Frivola and large field probably, and then if you want to hedge, play Benoit Saint-Denis in smaller field where you don't have to deal with the concern about as many dupes from him being like 45-50% owned. But I was telling you earlier that in small field, Benoit's probably going to be even higher owned. So if you play Frivola in small field and you get aggressive, then you can get even more leverage in small field theoretically. If he's going to be 65, if Benoit's going to be 65 or 70% owned, it's a big chunk of the field getting knocked off if Frivola can win this one.
I mean, there's a lot of risk reward tolerance needed on this slate. If you decide to fade a guy that has the potential to put up 150 in 3 rounds, that's extremely dangerous. And if you fade any of the main events or you play the opposite of the main event, your guy has a chance to score zero. So I would just say temper your expectations, know what you're getting into when you're playing this slate. It's going to be volatile and it's going to be destructive late in the night as we get a lot of these high upside, low floor fighters towards the end of the night. A lot of your lineups may be looking good or bad, and that can change literally in a blink of an eye on tonight's slate. So, all right, let's get into these two main events. We won't spend a ton of time, Jake, breaking them down. They are extremely interesting matchups. Let's start with the heavyweight fight, Aspinall and Pavlovich. Obviously, a lot of the concern for Aspinall, at least listening to his interviews, is the short notice nature of this fight for him. Yes, he's been training. Pavlovich was the backup fighter here. He is Aspinall has acknowledged that Pavlovich is the scariest man on the planet. So the vibes, hashtag vibes, aren't great for Aspinall here, but this seems pretty binary, right? It seems like Aspinall gets him to the ground, works him on the ground. Pavlovich KOs him. Both of these likely come in early. Which one do you think is more likely? And then if this somehow does bust, how does that happen?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, like you said, stepped in on like 17 days notice for Aspinall, and the fact that we just had Volkanovski stepping in on short notice for the title fight against Makhachev, obviously that's fresh on everyone's mind. So everyone's thinking about, how Volk got knocked out in round one. Obviously, we have some recency bias playing a factor here. Like you said, I think Aspinall has a good shot at taking Pavlovich down. Good chance at submitting him. He's faced three like pure strikers so far in the UFC. He subbed two of them and finished the other one with ground and pound. So I think we can pretty clearly say that Aspinall has a high fight IQ. He's going to take the path of least resistance. I think he's going to try to get Pavlovich down. Whether or not he can, that's a different story. I mean, we saw Pavlovich stuff the only takedown attempt that Curtis Blades attempted in that fight, but Curtis Blades was like half knocked out when he attempted that takedown attempt. So who knows, man? I do think that, Aspinall looks a little bit heavier. He weighed in like 261. Before his knee injury, he used to always weigh in around 250. And then I think his last fight was like 258. So he's the heaviest he's ever been. I mean, not surprising considering the short notice nature. His last three fights were all in the London. So he had the home crowd behind him. Now he's traveling over to the U.S. So a little bit of a different story. But, I mean, it's going to be a good fight. And I really think it does come down to, does Pavlovich clip him on the feet? Not that Aspinall can't knock out Pavlovich, but I think, he's going to try to take him down. So he could always get clipped shooting in. But if he gets him down, man, he'll have a good shot at getting a finish. I'd be surprised if the fight made it out of round one. I know that line has been getting bet up throughout the week. I actually got it at negative 110 to start the week that ends in round one. And it got up to negative 150 at DraftKings yesterday. I haven't looked. I think some places it's like 130-ish right now. But yeah, I mean, it's a pretty simple fight, man. Maybe Aspinall can take him down and not finish him, and that would be a way the fight gets extended into round two. And at that point, all bets are off for scoring. I mean, Aspinall takes Pavlovich down, controls him round one. Pavlovich knocks him out in round two, scores like 85 points or something. Or Aspinall finishes Pavlovich with a submission in round two or something. It doesn't score that well. There are some ways, but really good chance the winner scores really well. I'm on the Aspinall side. I'm definitely a little bit concerned about the stuff he's saying and just about the short notice nature, but I still see more ways to win for him. He could knock Pavlovich out in the feet. He could sub him. He could finish him with ground and pound. I don't think the fight's going to run long regardless of who wins. And we don't really know the cardio for either guy. I will say Pavlovich has been 5 rounds in the past, and Aspinall has never been out of the second round. So maybe Pavlovich would have better cardio, and maybe if the fight does go longer than people expect, maybe Aspinall would slow down midway through round two, and Pavlovich gets, I don't think he's ever knocked anyone out after the first round. I think all of his fights that went past round one went to the distance, but trends are made to be broken. So, Pavlovich, like round two, late round two, round three KO would not be the craziest thing and probably wouldn't score that well. So there's one way the fight could bust, but really intriguing fight, man. I'm on Aspinall sub personally.
Are we going to get an Almeida Lewis reincarnation here, and it's minus 10,000 to go the distance? I mean, obviously that was an anomaly, but this fight gets into bust quickly territory. That is a dangerous sentence to clip out of context, but very quickly gets into bust territory if this gets out of first round. If it gets out of round one, the odds of this becoming optimal drops dramatically. It's just that if you're gonna go that route, I mean, it's gonna be the longest 5 minutes of holding your breath of your life.
Yeah, I mean, Pavlovich hasn't seen the second round since 2017. 9 of Aspinall's last 10 fights have ended in round 1, and there was an early round 2 sub. So, I mean, yeah, it's all the numbers say it ends in round 1, but those are the times when, when everyone's betting on it to do one thing, that's when it does the other thing.
Do you think this will be the highest owned combined fight on the card?
Yeah, for sure, man. Right now, I have it projected at like 86%, which is, above the other 5 round fight, and wouldn't be entirely shocked if it hit 90 even.
So just by the math, right? If it's basically slightly worse than a coin flip to make it out of round two, yet 90% of the field is on the fight, and it's can bust pretty quickly after round one. I think if you're playing optimally, you probably don't match the field. You got to go underweight on this event. Whether that's a full fade, that's up to your risk tolerance. But if you're playing 20 or 150, I think under the field in general has to be the play because you have to get different somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, we have a large enough slate. I mean, if this was like an 11 fight card,
True.
I think I would seriously be telling people to go 0% on the fight and
Yeah.
just pray that it runs 13 fights. Like it's going to be easier to get unique, especially with the ownership spread out on these 5 round fighters. Like the only way that it's going to be really hard to get unique is if if Benoit scores 150 and Rebecca scores 130 and
True.
all the 5 round fighters score well, and then the popular dogs go off. Like, yeah, then we could hit like a large split. But I think that it's going to be a little bit easier to get unique on this card than some of the cards with 2 5 round fights we've seen in the past that were at times smaller.
For sure. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I mentioned at the top of the show, but the ownership discrepancy on this slate is crazy. We have so many guys, so many fighters, 28% or higher, and then basically the other half is 23% or lower, with a vast majority of them under 20%. So there's no shortage of low-owned plays on this type of card. Speaking of which, someone in the chat, Londo, says Emmers is super low-owned, think he's worth a play, might get a finish, and no one is going to play him. Yeah, we always like advocating for the 10% owned 9K plays. This time it's not a female fighter. However, the scoring ceiling may be the same for Emmers. But just quickly, Emmers and Van, thoughts on those guys as low owned pivots from Rambetsky and Saint-Denis at the top.
Yes, historically, Emmers has really struggled to score well. He had that one fight against like Vince Cachorro or whatever that guy's name is. That was fighting up a weight class, short notice debuter, and I think Emmers scored like I want to say like 109 or something in that win. All of his other wins, he struggled to score well. He missed weight by a pound, not a great look. But yeah, man, Bazookia, not very good. So I mean, yeah, like it's a decent spot to target at really low ownership. And I was just looking at like some numbers earlier, and I was just kind of curious, like opening these pay-per-view cards, how guys have historically done scoring wise. And for what maybe it's a small sample bias, I don't know, but it was like 70% of the fights on pay-per-view cards in male fights, the winner of the fight ended up in like the winning DraftKings lineup, which I was really surprised about because the number was like 38% on non-pay-per-view. And again, it was a pretty small sample, so maybe it's just noise, but I was pretty surprised that they had done that well for opening pay-per-view cards. So at super low ownership in a favorable matchup, I get playing some members, man, even though he struggled and even though he missed weight by a pound.
Yeah, that's totally fair. I see Eagles in the chat says he bet Pavlovich to win by decision. Eagles, make sure you extend the invite to your private island once that bet hits. So good luck to you. A couple more questions before we get into the actual main event of Pereira and Prochazka. Let's see. We got a question from Cam. Thoughts on Andrade versus Dern? This is a fight probably we wouldn't have touched on very much given the rest of the show's sections, but Cam mentions Andrade made a bunch of comments fighting so much as you're to pay for her divorce. I thought, is Dern not the one paying for divorce? Anyways,
they both are.
Oh, they both are. Okay, so either way, it seems like two fighters in opposite directions. I think that's the consensus here. But just thoughts on that fight, how it plays out, really quickly.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a pretty clear, like, if Dern gets the fight down, good chance for a submission. If it stays standing, good chance that Andrade just kills her. Dern looked good on the feet in her last fight. It was against Hill. So I don't think it's insane to think Dern could get her first career knockout here against Andrade. But at the same time, it seems like a good sell high spot on Dern and a good buy low spot on Andrade. I think Andrade could be fighting for a job. I think she's had some really tough matchups. And I think Dern has such terrible wrestling. I actually really like Andrade in this spot. So cheap, so high volume. Dern is super hittable. If Andrade keeps the fight standing and like doesn't randomly get knocked out, I think she dominates, and I think she's going to be low owned. She's cheap, and she has the high ceiling. So I like Andrade here.
All right, good answer there, Jake. Let me see. I think we got them all. There was a comment about Pat Sabatini. We'll get to that once we get to the good fighter, bad fighter section. All right, Jake. Now the fight that was planned all along and is Prochazka's back to defend his original lightweight title. This one a little more interesting, and I think it's so obvious, Jake, at least to me, and probably most people watching, that we know the weaknesses of the fighters in these contests, right? Pereira's ground game, Prochazka is leaving his chin in the air in his striking defense. Pavlovich, his unknown ground game. Aspinall is the only one with a true weakness, I guess, the short notice nature of this fight. So we know how these fighters are going to win, most likely. It's just which one's strengths or weaknesses come to the forefront. So we know how this is going to play out generally. Just quickly, how do you think this fight ends up working? And then I guess more importantly, this one's not gonna have as much. It'll still have a lot of ownership. It won't have as much as Aspinall and Pavlovich. But if this fight busts, how does that happen?
Yeah, man. I mean, you kind of said it all. Like Pereira, 36 years old. Just his second fight up at light heavyweight. He got knocked out by Adesanya in what was it, April, and then he moved up a few months later to light heavyweight. I took on Jan Blachowicz. He was getting controlled for the entire first round. That fight was at elevation in Salt Lake City. Blachowicz completely gassed out after nearly stubbing Pereira. Pereira ends up winning the last two rounds. Well, on two of the three scorecards, wins a split decision. I thought he looked bad. It was his first fight at light heavyweight. Maybe you give him a break for that. But he still never knocked anyone out at the weight class. He had two kickboxing matches at light heavyweight, both decisions. He had one MMA fight at light heavyweight, not a very impressive decision. So, I mean, the main question with him is his power going to translate up to the higher weight class? And is he going to be able to knock out larger opponents? Because he was the boogeyman at 185. He was giant, he was scary, he was knocking everyone out. He hasn't shown that at light heavyweight yet. And everyone's just kind of assuming that it's going to happen. Like, oh, well, he's got the power. Like, okay, well, he's got power at 185. I mean, this is 205 now. Right. The guys are significantly bigger. So we'll see. Maybe he's going to look better here than his last time. But if he shows up the way he looked against Jan, then I think he gets knocked out, man. I think the Yuri's got more explosive power. Pereira's the more technical striker, but in terms of just like raw, aggressive power where you can knock people out from like all sorts of positions, I think that all favors Prochazka, who's 5 years younger than Pereira. He's fought his entire career at light heavyweight. He's knocked out dozens of other light heavyweights in the past. He's shown he can do it. I mean, he's coming off the shoulder injury, or if you're a conspiracy theorist, the USADA suspension made it look like a fake shoulder injury. But yeah, no, I mean, he's coming off the shoulder injury, so you don't know how like he's going to look after that first fight back. It's been a year and a half, so that's a little bit of a red flag for Prochazka. Like we generally aren't looking to be super excited about playing guys that haven't fought in over a year, and it's been 17 months. So there are some concerns. He hasn't like shown that he's going to be the same person he was before, but if he is, Pereira has been pretty chinny. Prochazka, while he leaves his chin up, he hasn't been knocked out since 2015, which was his last loss. He's gone like 8 years without being finished or even losing a fight. Yeah, man, I'm on the Yuri side. I think that he's going to catch Pereira at some point, probably in the first two rounds, and knock Pereira out. I'm going to say Yuri in round two knockout of Pereira, but I mean, either guy could finish that, or theoretically. I mean, Yuri could look worse, Pereira could look better, but if they both look like they looked in their last fights, then give me Yuri all day here.
That's fair. And if this fight busts, is it just a matter of getting out of the first round, or any other way that maybe this ownership doesn't hold up for the likelihood of this fight ending up in the optimal lineup?
Yeah, so Pereira's sort of lower volume at times, sort of technical. And if Yuri has some ring rust to knock off, let's say we get a slower start in round one, makes it into round two, either guy gets a knockout, but especially if Pereira gets an early second round knockout because he's a little bit more expensive, then that's how the fight busts. Early second, early third round knockout, because we're not going to see really much grappling. Maybe Yuri mixes in some wrestling. He talks about working on his wrestling a little bit, and that's obviously the weak point for Pereira, but I don't really think it happens. I think we're going to get all striking. So, yeah, I think one of those early mid-round knockouts followed by less volume than expected is how the fight busts, where the winner scored like 95 points, and that ends up not being enough because we get a higher scoring slate.
Yeah, definitely. And just quickly, I know most of this is DraftKings based, but you mentioned a point about the title fights. Both title fights are relatively cheap on FanDuel, but particularly the heavyweight fight, right? What are the two salaries for Aspinall and Pavlovich over there?
Yeah, Pavlovich is just $15. Aspinall $16, so much harder for that one to get left out. In terms of Pereira is 20 and Jiri $18, so a little bit tougher, I'm sorry, a little bit easier for that one to get left out relatively.
For sure. Paper Chaser asked a question about single entry GPPs and the title fights. Yeah, scroll back to the beginning, 10-minute mark or so, where we talk about our strategy for how to approach the title fights in single entry contests. Hint, play more lineups is our answer there. All right, it is 3:30. We'll be here for 15 more minutes. If you guys have more questions, throw them in the chat. We still got a lot to get through here. We got to talk about Borjas, the debuting fighter. We have to discuss good fighter, bad fighter for those fighters with less than 4 fights under their belt. And then prize picks, fight the target, string parlay. So let's get through it. Jake, Kevin Borjas, the only debuting fighter on the card. Let's scroll down to the bottom here. He is facing Joshua Van. Let's keep all this pretty brief. Borjas, what does his level of competition look like pre-UFC? What type of fighter is he? And how does he fare in this first fight?
He's coming off the Peruvian regional scene, so not a very heralded place to fight. So he's 9-1, 25 years old, 8 knockouts in Peru, and then he comes on Dana White Contender Series and goes to the judges for the first time. Showed a non-existent grappling game, got taken down 5 times, controlled for like 8 minutes. But he's a good striker, specifically boxing. He's got heavy hands. He's fought at 125 and 135, so he's got good size. But he's just a pure striker, man. Absolutely no ground game. Really needs to develop that. Still young, so maybe he can, but yeah, he just relies entirely on knocking people out with his hands. And he's a crisp boxer. Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much it, man. Good volume, good striking, no ground game.
All right, fair enough. All right, let's play good fighter, bad fighter, good matchup, bad matchup. There's a quick game. We talk about fighters with less than 4 fights, give some context to their stats. Jay's going to say whether they're actually good or bad, and if this matchup tonight is actually good or bad for their DFS potential. And we'll start from the first fight of the night until the last fight of the night. In the first fight, we mentioned Dennis Bazookia up against Jamal Emmers before, and you actually even called Bazookia bad originally, so I'm assuming your opinion has not changed in the last 10 minutes, Jake, on Bazookia. So assuming he's a bad fighter, is this a good or bad matchup for him against Jamal Emmers?
Yeah, bad fighter, bad matchup.
I just want to play devil's advocate here for a second. Emmers' weight miss hasn't looked that great since his knee injury. Any chance Bazookia can surprise here?
I mean, Bazooka has the home crowd behind him. His name is Bazooka, so I guess theoretically his power, right? That's how that works. I feel like if this guy's name was Butterknife, no one would be thinking that he's knocking out Emmers. But he's got okay power, but if you look at his record, he's like, oh, he's got 4 knockouts and a submission. Then you look at who he was knocking out. He's been knocking out like complete bums.
Right.
So like, yeah, I mean, Emmers has been knocked out twice in his career. Theoretically, anyone could knock anyone else out. Bazooka has as good a shot, I would say, as any other bad fighter, but it's a tough matchup because Emmers can wrestle, Emmers can strike, Emmers generally does a good job of moving around, staying on the outside, and if he gets in trouble, he'll take Bazooka down. So it's really going to have to be like a Hail Mary, knockout shot. What are his odds on finishing? 13% at plus 600. That's probably about right. Maybe I would say maybe a little bit lower. I mean, I would give him like 8 to 10% chance of landing a knockout, and he's going to be 11% owned. So take it for what it's worth.
All right, fine. Okay, Joshua Van up against Kevin Borjas. Van, we saw live in Jacksonville at the live final, get the win over, unfortunately, Zhalgas Zhumagulov, who has lost his 90th straight split decision. But Van, in his second fight, is he good or bad? And is this a good or bad matchup against the striking of Borjas?
Yeah, so Van's a good striker. He doesn't really have any ground game, although he did show an improved takedown defense in his recent UFC debut, which was on short notice, although Zalgas, has like a terrible takedown accuracy, so it's possible that was sort of a mirage. So Van's a good striker, but until he has more of a grappling game, I'm not sure I can call him a good fighter, because when he faces actual good fighters, he's going to get exposed on the mat. But this is a great matchup because Borjas does not grapple whatsoever, so this is a pure striking battle here. So yeah, it's an exciting fight. I would say bad one-dimensional strikers who are good at striking but are overall bad MMA fighters because they can't grapple at all. But it's a good matchup because they're basically mirror images of each other.
For sure. Totally. All right, next we have Nazim Sadikov against our boy Barshev. Slava Klaus here. Sadikov, as you mentioned in your write-ups, Jake, not the most intelligent fighter. If there's one IQ test, it is fighting. a one-dimensional striker like Barshev here. But Sadikov, is he good or bad? Is this a good or bad matchup?
Yeah, I think he's bad, but this is like the best matchup you could ever ask for in terms of getting your grappling going. I mean, Borshev is literally like the worst grappler in the UFC. And Sadikov at least trains at Serlongo up in New York, and he trains with Dvalishvili, trains with Aljo, with Perivola. Like, they have to come in with a grappling heavy game plan. If you listen to his interviews, he's like, "Yeah, I'm a better MMA fighter, which means I'm going to wrestle." But then he's
Right.
like, "But I don't have to wrestle. I want to show that I can stand up." You're like, no, stick with you. You're a better MMA fighter. Like,
Anytime say they want to say
what are
they
you
want to
talking
show
about?
their striking, I mean, that's almost an auto fade territory, right? God damn, I hate when people say that.
I think he's gonna wrestle though, man. I really, even if he wants to strike, I think he's gonna get kicked in the body a couple times. Be like, okay,
Nah,
I have
fuck
no
this.
choice. I have to wrestle. And at that point, I think it's gonna look like he's negative 400 once the fight gets on the mat. I'm hoping at least because there was a regional fight where he landed like 5 takedowns
Yeah.
a couple of years ago, and I'm basically like planting my flag on that. Like, look, he can do it. He landed multiple takedowns. So yeah, I mean, anytime someone can wrestle and they're fighting Borshev, it doesn't matter if they're bad as long as they can wrestle because it's going to be a good matchup.
Fair enough. We got a few questions in the chat. Fortunately, our guy Londo is in there answering every single question, giving his opinion. So thank you, Londo, for taking care of some of that hard work. We'll get to those questions here at the end of this segment. Let me see here. Next, we have Mateusz Rambetsky, which somehow that is how it's pronounced. He is the biggest favorite on the card now, up against Roosevelt Roberts. Is he good or bad? Is this a good or bad matchup?
Yeah, he's good, and this is a good matchup. Robert stepped in Monday night. He's a UFC retread. He got cut, and then he went on the Ultimate Fighter, and then he lost on the Ultimate Fighter. And Dana was like, "Yeah, his last fight was terrible. That's not what we want to see." Boom, he's back in the UFC somehow. Missed weight by a pound, looked bad on the scale, stepped in on 4 days' notice. Yeah, so it's a good matchup for Rebetsky.
All
He's a
right.
good fighter.
Yeah, that's pretty fair. All right, next we have a matchup with two guys in the flyweight division who do not have many fights in the UFC. Steve Erceg, Alessandro Costa. Quickly, are these guys good or bad? And is this a good or bad matchup for either?
I mean, they're both kind of mediocre. I'm lower than the field on Urseg. I think he's like a decent grappler. He's an okay striker. He's got size for the division, which is probably his best thing. Like, he's only got one knockout. He's got a bunch of submissions. He's coming off Eternal MMA. I don't know. I still think that both guys cannot be considered good fighters, despite the fact that Urseg came in on short notice, beat David Dvorak in kind of an uneventful, low volume decision where Urseg had one big moment where he dropped Dvorak late in the second round, couldn't finish him. Um, it's kind of a meh fighters in a meh matchup for me, man. I think Costa has good defensive wrestling. He has good leg kicks. He has been knocked out twice, so I think that's kind of the hope there for Urseg. I don't think Urseg can get Costa down, so I think it's kind of like a Hail Mary KO or bust. And Urseg has one knockout in his career, so I don't know. I'm gonna kind of call them bad fighters and bad matchups for both guys.
Now, based on that, it is unfortunate that both these guys are low owned because it doesn't sound like a very high upside fight, but it's still a fight that we have to target because I think both guys are going to be under 20%, right?
They are. They are. I think both guys are low volume, so they have to land knockouts to win. So I don't really think either one of them submitting the other. And it has to be well timed. Like, if you get a
Yeah.
poorly timed knockout, they could score like 85, 90 points if it's like a later round poorly timed knockout. Because I just don't think we see a ton of volume. I think Costa kicks the legs. I think he does a good job defending takedowns. I think Urseg will methodically use his size to land on Costa, maybe knock him out, but probably not. Probably get a low volume decision.
Yeah, and it hurts that they're both priced right around both 5 round fights, right? If it was much different, one was much higher price and one was lower price, a little more likely, just a lot of competition in that price range. So, all right, finally we have Diego Lopez. Lots of questions. I mean, tons of questions about Pat Sabatini in the chat. Pat Sabatini is at the top of our occupied model, and rightfully so, Jake. When you look at any actual charting or metrics, Diego Lopez just gives up a ton of ground control, is content fighting off his back. And this screams potential ceiling spot for Sabatini, but we saw what he did to Tucker. We saw how dangerous he was against Evloev. So, this is one of those spots where, yes, the numbers are going to say Sabatini heavy, but it's a very dangerous spot where Sabatini could score 5 or he could score 120. Am I off base here? And either way, is Lopez as good or bad as he's shown so far? And is it a good or bad matchup for Sabatini?
Yeah, I mean, super interesting matchup. Like you mentioned, Diego Lopez, no defensive wrestling. He's just like, yeah, take me down. He's basically Paul Craig with better striking because he can knock you
Yeah.
out on the feet, but he's low volume. He wants you to take him down so he can work out of his guard on his back. The problem is, like, it's a terrible matchup for Lopez. Like, Pat Sabatini is like a high level black belt, D1 wrestler. Like, he's probably not, he's never been subbed before. He's probably not going to fall for any of Lopez's tricks. I think he's probably going to stay safe. Maybe Lopez's submission threat forces Sabatini to be a little safer on the mat, where, you know, we just saw Sabatini go crazy against Almeida, and he landed like a ton of ground and pound, finished him in the second round. You know, great performance. I think that Lopez is going to be active enough off his back that it's going to be harder for Sabatini to really unload, so he might just be holding top position more. And I think Lopez is a better striker than Sabatini. So Sabatini, his one way to win is to go like head first into the fire,
Yeah.
you know, where Diego Lopez has no problem working off his back, but it's we just need to avoid where like Sabatini controls him for all of round one, takes him down in round two, and then gets finished somehow where both guys bust. Because both
Gotcha.
guys have decent potential, but Lopez's style is not it's not a great style for DFS just because when he's on his back, he's not getting control time. You know, he's generally looking for submissions, not landing ground strikes. So like as the clock from the fight ticks down, so does his point scoring,
Yeah.
where it's just harder for him to score well. But I like Sabatini, man. I think that he's going to get control time. He's going to get some ground strikes. I mean, I like him specifically on DraftKings where control time is going to be a big factor. I really don't think we see a submission in this fight. I think it's either going to be a Sabatini grappling heavy decision where he gets double digit control time and multiple takedowns, or else Lopez is going to knock him out before the fight hits the mat. But I like Sabatini decision there.
Yeah, I think that's a great breakdown. And just another reason why you may look at the model and say, oh, Diego Lopez is super low based on his knockout potential and whatnot. And the reasons Jake just laid out is exactly why that is the case. So good stuff there, Jake. TDC says, how do you effectively use the Occupy model to build an MMA lineup? Yeah, the best way is to, we have a couple tutorials here on YouTube in the lineup builder, but also just read the daily plug that Jake puts out and just follow the lineup construction tips in there and then match that up with the Occupy model. And you can build a lineup depending on the contest and the site that you are playing on. Eagle says, do we think there's a higher score night in GPPs, maybe 700 plus points needed to win? How do you think the overall scoring of the slate's going to look?
I think it probably will be higher scoring because pricing is loose enough that I think you're going to be able to fit the top six scores in. Like, I don't think we're going to have, you know, high scores cannibalizing each other like we often do. But at the same time, we don't have a ton of great options at the top. You know, we have like Saint Denis and we have Robetsky, but there's a lot of people that won't necessarily put up huge scores in a win. So it kind of goes both ways. I don't think it's going to be crazy scoring. I don't think it's going to be low scoring. I think it's probably going to be, you know, like the mid 600s or something, like sort of normal-ish. But yeah.
And I think with the main events, I'm surprised no one's asked this question yet, but with the main events being priced where they are, and the two lower ceiling options based on their ownership in Emmers and Van, Dern potentially as well. If we get a bust from either Rebecca and or Saint Denis, salary could look pretty crazy considering it is a 13 fight card and generally salary being left over isn't that big on these size cards, but I think this card could warrant some salary left over and not worrying too much about, you know, leaving a few hundred, even 1,000 or more on the table.
Yeah, totally. I totally agree. Like specifically, because I don't really think Rebetsky is losing, but I think Sandin could. And I think the key to leaving a ton of salary is if Frivola wins.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. Because if Frola gets a KO, scores 100 points at 7,100, the slate massively opens up, and then we have the killers in the 77 to $8,400 range. So really interesting there. All right, let's close out the show here. Prize picks play of the week, a fight that you have to target in DFS, which you may have figured out by now as we've been talking for 45 minutes. And then our title fight stream parlay of the week. So you see the Prize Picks promo code here on screen. If you're not already signed up for Prize Picks, use promo code OCCUPY, get a 100% deposit match bonus up to $100. You can parlay all sorts of props across different sports. Jake, which one to you has stood out the most this week as far as their UFC props go?
Yeah, it's a little bit of a tricky week on prize picks, but I like the Tom Aspinall under 5 minutes. And we talked about it a bunch. I don't need to go into it more, but you know, Pav hasn't seen the second round since 2017. 9 of Aspinall's 10 fights. The last 10 have ended in round one. That prop is negative 130 to negative 150, depending on where you look. And it's a great hedge if you're going underweight
True.
on that fight in DFS.
Yeah, not a lot of people talk about hedging prop bets or totals or sides when it comes to your DFS exposure, but you can certainly do that. Fight ends in round one. If you're under the field here, if you fade Pavlovich, his bet is round one KO. Lots of ways you can play it here. So, all right, fight that you have to target in DFS. We're gonna throw out the main events because those are too obvious. We've mentioned quite a few here, Jake. The Saint Denis fight, the Sabatini fight. Which one are you going to throw out here for the people that you think that whoever wins is very likely to end up in the optimal lineup?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many you can do. I think that the best one is also the most obvious one is the Saint Denis and Frivola. It's just so hard to see the winner not scoring well just based on the pace of Saint Denis. And, Frivola, the three in a row first round knockouts doesn't hurt either.
Yeah. Certainly. All right, let's get to our title fight stream parlay. We do this every week. Oh, not every week, every video when there are 12 fights or more. I give a prop or a side or total. Jake gives one. We parlay it together, and we try to win enough money to buy a car. And we've hit some Volvos and some. The Corolla? What have we been calling it? The Lambo or the what parlay, Jake? What have we been calling the cheaper car parlays?
I think it was the cheap electric hybrid,
Yeah.
like maybe like a Volt or something.
Yeah, the Volt parlay of the week. This is a little more, maybe in between. All right, so for my side, we talked about Prochazka at length. I'm going to go Jiri by KO, plus 190, plus 200, depending on where you look. I think if he wins, that is the most likely outcome. So I think there's some value in the percentages compared to his money line. So I'll go Jiri by KO. Jake, who are you going to pair it with?
Yeah, I like that. I'm gonna go with an Aspinall sub at plus 410. I really think that he's gonna get the fight to the ground. Two of his last three finishes on the mat were by submission. He even mentioned that it would be great to take Pavlovich down and sub him. BJJ black belt. I think the plus 410 compared to the negative 105 money line. I think it's pretty solid. He could knock him out, but I'm willing to take a shot here. So you parlay those together. That's gonna be plus 1404.
All right, somewhere in between. Maybe go an Ultima or something with that parlay. So I like that, Jake. All right, guys, I have one more question for Jake. I'm gonna ask at the very end of the show. Let's get some housekeeping out of the way. If you're not subscribed here on YouTube and you like what you saw, make sure you do so. It is free to do. Click the red subscribe button below this video. Around half of our subscribers or half of our viewers are subscribers. Let's rectify that. Let's get that closer to 100%. You'll get notified when we go live. We don't do these videos every week. We're at the mercy of, well, we made the rule, but we're at the mercy of the UFC matchmakers and how many fights we get on a card. 12 fights or more. So get notified by being subscribed. That'll let you know if we upload a video on Friday night or if we go live on a Saturday. Just being subscribed is the best way to do so. If you play other sports, NFL, NBA, we're doing live streams and videos every day for that as well. So subscribing on YouTube is the best free way to get our content. Give us a thumbs up if you appreciate the content. It helps the channel out tremendously. We would love you if you would do that. If you're the type of person, we know we do these videos for free to help everyone, but if you're the type of person that wants the extra edge and you're not signed up already for either Occupy Fantasy or MMADFS.com, go ahead and do so. I mean, we're talking about individual fight breakdowns, bets, top plays, core plays, lineup construction tips, predictive models, early bets, lineup builders between the two sites. If you want that extra edge in MMA DFS and you want to be that type of person that knows everything before you enter a contest, make sure you subscribe to our sites to get that info. And then, Jacob, the question I was going to ask you before we get out of here, give me a prediction, the fighter under 20% that ends up in the optimal lineup, under 20% projected ownership.
Let me pull up ownership. Under 20% that ends up in the winning lineup is going to be. You gotta give two, or I gotta give one here?
You can give one. I'll give you one.
Man, I kind of like Borjas, man. I think that he could randomly land a knockout here. He looks kind of big next to Van, so I'm gonna say Borjas comes in his UFC debut on a pay-per-view card at Madison Square Garden, lands a knockout, and ends up in the winning lineup.
It's funny because my answer was going to be Van. So whether you choose to believe me or Jake, this is a fight that has two low-owned guys that have a chance to put up slate-breaking scores. So use that information as you will. And I did have one more thing I wanted to bring up. Oh, someone asked about Gyung Gong, the now mispriced underdog. Was he plus 110 now against John Castaneda? Lots of issues around Castaneda's weight cut in camp. But Gong going to be one of the more popular 3-round dogs, if not the most popular 3-round dog. Jake, just in general, how are you handling this fight? Because I did see someone ask about it at the very beginning, and then we'll get out of here.
Yeah, so I think I'm taking Kong to win. He's plus 110. I like him. He's got good grappling. He's got a good jab. He's taller. Castaneda gassed out in the second round the last time he requested a catchweight fight, which was against Daniel Santos, where he almost broke the slate. He almost finished Santos. Then he gassed out, and he requested a 5-pound catchweight that time. They didn't say who requested it this time, but I'm like 99% sure Castaneda did the same thing once again. It literally was the exact same thing, like mid-fight week, requesting a catchweight. Last time he blamed it on antibiotics. This time he'll probably say something a week later.
He was in the shame box too, right, in the weigh-ins?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I can check.
Yeah, so that would
straight to the shame box. Yeah, straight to the shame box. Yeah, no, good point. Which was weird because it was 138-pound catch weight. He weighed 137.6, but I guess he probably was in the back like 138.1, and he took his shorts off. I think normally they're like a half pound. But anyways, on Kang, I think that he needs to finish to end up in tournament winning lineups, most likely. I really like him in smaller field stuff. I think he's good in cash. He'll probably be a little bit over-owned relative to his chances of ending up in the winning tournament lineup, just because he probably needs a finish. And all of his finishes have come by submission. Castaneda's never been subbed as a wrestling background. So I kind of like Kang to win a decision and score like 75 points. All of his high-scoring decisions were from grappling, and I think he's going to have a tougher time in this matchup. So I think he's just going to out-jab his way to victory. And unless he can land a knockout, which no one's been knocked out in one of his fights for like 12 years or something, unless he can land a knockout, I think it's going to be hard for him to end up in tournament-winning lineups. But I do like him. He's got a solid floor, and I think he has a good chance. I'd rather bet him and play him in small field than play him in tournaments. But I'm going to have some exposure for sure because Castaneda could gas. And if that happens, Kane could finish him and put up a big score. But I do think he needs Castaneda to gas to get a finish.
Yeah, that's fair. All right, good stuff, Jake. And I think we gave out as much information as we possibly could. For more info, check out MMADFS.com, OccupyFantasy.com. We appreciate all of you tuning in on this Saturday afternoon. Good luck tonight and enjoy UFC 295.